Hello, and welcome to my Precision Teaching podcast. My name is Rick Cabina, and it is January 2008. Well, starting the new year, I would like to first say Happy New Year to everyone. And this year's past marked a number of significant events for precision teaching. Most recently in November, another successful conference was held, the International Precision Teaching Conference, which was held in Kansas. And from what I understand, although I couldn't attend, by all accounts, it was a very well-received conference and an increase in student numbers, which is always a positive. And of course, the usual cast of characters were there, talking about the different interventions that people were doing, not only in private institutions, but in public schools and beyond. This coming year, in 2008, by the way, the next conference will be held at Rutgers, and we will look forward to that conference. Also, this past year, I think just from my own personal standpoint, at my university, we had a number of teachers who are very good precision teachers who actually have graduated and now are gainfully employed. At my website, as a matter of fact, if you look at the pick of the month, I have a bulletin board from Sean Datchick, who is a precision teacher, and very happy that he's out there doing good things to the students he's working with in the wonderful city of New Orleans. So, 2007 has come and gone. I think the listserv that we have continues to grow. We're probably at, I think the last I counted was 260 members, so that's a healthy number. The Journal of Precision Teaching is, well, as a matter of fact, I recently spoke with a colleague who is helping to have that prepared for publication, and he informs me that that will be coming along shortly, so that's another good sign for precision teachers. And let's see, what am I missing here? 2007, students graduating, check. Conference done, check. Journal completed, check. I think those are some of the big things that happened. May have forgotten some, but I guess to make a long story short, this past year has been a good one for precision teachers. Oh, how can I forget this? There is a wiki, a precision teaching wiki, and that has been online. And let me tell you, it is just absolutely remarkable. And all precision teachers owe a debt of gratitude to Regina, who has made that website just an incredible resource for all of precision teachers. And if I could ask you to visit something that really shows that's one site that has lots of information about precision teaching, that would be the site that I would direct you to. So Regina Claypool-Frey, or is it Fry? Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that last name. That is certainly a debt of gratitude that we owe you. So, 2008, one of the things that I'll be doing with my podcast is I'll try to have an announcement section, and I'll also start, not this podcast, but in future podcasts, I'll have an article review. So I plan on trying to expand this podcast into a section for announcements, a section for an article review, and then, of course, I'll have an interview each month that I put this out. But an announcement is that on celebration.org, so point your browsers to celebration.org, if you are a member, you will have access to the Journal of Precision Teaching and Celebration. And Scott Bourne, who has really just tirelessly done things behind the scene for the sake of the Standard Celebration Society and Precision Teachers, has really put in some hours, and he has made it possible so that on that website, if you're a member, which is, again, I suppose, a plug to join the Standard Celebration Society and become a member, you'll be able to have access to past journals of JPTC and C. Right now, as I understand it, a few volumes are up there, and each successive month, more volumes will be put up there, and soon the entire collection will be on there. So access to past work from Precision Teachers will be at your fingertips. So that announcement is a happy one. Well, with that, I would like to introduce the upcoming interview, which is with Clay Starlin. And this interview, as all the other ones, I've thoroughly enjoyed doing it. I always learn so much from speaking with my colleagues, and this one, as in the ones past, is no different. Full of information, very good insight, and I guess on the technical side, I would say that I'm almost there where I've figured out a way to do podcasts that can be heard with good quality. This last one, the one before this, I used Skype. This one, I used the phone line like I did with Steve Graff, and I enhanced the sound. My sound is okay, but Clay's was somewhat diminished, so I enhanced it. So when you listen to it, you'll probably hear a hissing or a buzzing, but it's not that bad. So I'm getting there, and I hope that by the next podcast that I do, I have this situation completely figured out so that the podcasts that I bring you are of highest quality. So with that, let's turn to the interview. I would like to welcome Dr. Clay Starlin to my Precision Teaching podcast. And just as a background, I'd like to say that I've known Clay probably since I was a graduate student at Ohio State, and I wrote Clay an email as a graduate student, and he was very generous. He sent me back a package with articles, and I've been talking to him ever since. So Clay is probably, he is an incredible innovator in our field, just very brilliant, and I'd like to welcome you to the podcast today.
Well, thank you, Rick. We seem to have a mutual admiration society, so I appreciate the introduction. And I'm interested in our chat.
Well, I always like to start off our discussion by asking people, how did you get into precision teaching? So if you could just share your background and how you got into precision teaching, that would be great.
Okay. Well, Ogden Lindsley, our founder, moved to the University of Kansas in 1965 after starting to work with patients in Met State Hospital as the first person who applied operant conditioning with people. And he brought two graduate students with him to the University of Kansas, Eric Houghton and Ann Dell Duncan. And Eric finished up his doctoral degree in 1967 and moved to the University of Oregon, where I had just started the doctoral program. And I took my first course from Eric in the winter of 1968. So that was the beginning of my introduction to precision teaching.
Mm-hmm. So Eric was your advisor, your chart parent, so it would be?
That's correct. I had a lot of contact with Ogden as well during that time because it was kind of early in the process, and so there weren't a lot of us, and so I'd gone back to a short course that Ogden had given in '69, and had a lot of contact with Og as well as Eric. But yes, Eric was my dissertation advisor.
So you graduated from the University of Oregon, and what did you do after that?
Well, I took a job in what's called a Regional Interdistrict Cooperative in Minnesota, also known as Intermediate Education District. This was centered in Bemidji, Minnesota, and we had 15 school districts. It was actually my fantasy job. I actually wanted to get a half a salary from a college of education, half a salary from a school district. That was ideal, but what I was able to negotiate was basically a half-time or full-time salary from a college, but I was loaned out half-time to the school district, so I kind of had my foot in both the in-service and pre-service world. And it turned out that I was hired to establish what was called a Special Learning and Behavior Problem Master's Program at Bemidji State College, and it was a graduate program, and basically all the teachers that were in the program I was out supervising in the field, so it really did in fact kind of achieve my goal of being able to work with people in a pre-service environment as well as out in the field. So that was what I did immediately after graduating with my degree at the University of Oregon.
Now that must have been something to be out in the field at the time when, well, really at the time when precision teaching was being launched. What was it like with, I've heard other people talk about what it was like early on, that there were so many discoveries that, I think Ogden would say that there were so many discoveries at the time you couldn't keep up with them. Right. Was that your experience? I imagine if you're working with teachers, not only was this new to you, but you get a chance to see just this widespread application. It's new. What is that a good description of what it was like at the time?
Very, very much so. I can describe a variety of kind of things that occurred that were kind of are now viewed as part of our educational kind of culture, not just precision teaching, but just educational culture in particular. Interestingly enough, the first summer that my previous spouse, Clay Starlin is her name now, but when Ann and I moved to Minnesota, the first summer that before we started, Og came and gave a workshop. So this was sort of like we were basically communicated that if we were hired, that this is the technology that we were going to be using. And at that time, this was before 94-142, and special ed was, a relatively new concept in terms of ensuring that students with disabilities had, services. Minnesota was a pretty progressive state in that sense, but we were off in northern Minnesota, and two people that had special education degrees, so in some sense we were sort of looked to as having some expertise that not too many other people in the area had. So in that sense it was helpful to sort of be able to move forward on an agenda that was pretty new in the field, precision teaching, but since no one kind of in that area knew any better, they pretty much were willing to accept our advice, and that made the implementation relatively smooth because we've had our bumps along the way in terms of resistance. But one example is I'd done my dissertation in the reading area, and probably had looked at least 1,000 charts by the time we moved to Minnesota. And a lot of the charts, a lot of the reading charts, like particularly the oral reading charts, were relatively small improvement. What we had called 10%, 20% improvement, 1.1, 1.2 kind of growth.
Mm-hmm.
And a couple of years after we were there, I walked into one of the teachers', and it was mostly a resource kind of room setting, and I looked at some charts that were probably more like times 1.8 or times 2. They were doubling. Her name was Artie Rado, and I said, Artie, what are you doing? I've never seen any reading charts like that. And what she was doing was repeated reading.
Ah, and what year was that?
Probably around 73.
Wow.
Somewhere like that. But it's one of those things where I wouldn't have recognized the power of the intervention if I had not been looking at a standard graphic display for years and seen a lot of relatively low growth charts, and I could dramatically see the difference. And so in that sense, it became kind of a discovery, and now people talk about repeated reading, and someone named Jay Samuels kind of gets some credit for it.
Yeah.
He was in Minnesota at the time, so and still is. So that's just one example of kind of the discoveries that we were able to make by using a standard graphic format to communicate to ourselves.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting, because when I think back to what you're saying, well, and even the area too, it seems that a lot of what happened at that time actually, as you point out, did make it well beyond precision teaching. For example, I can think about curriculum-based measurement, and I actually went back and I remember reviewing it was an ERIC document, and it was probably one of the first ones that was written, and a lot of the language in this ERIC document was right from precision teaching, but what I found ironic is there were no references to precision teaching. So they were saying, not only were they using frequency measurements, but other types of precision teaching jargon that we use. I think there was some learning channels in there, and describing charts as, it wasn't like turns, but accelerate, just those types of terms. I have to go back and look at it, but I thought that was interesting too.
Yeah, well, some other interesting aspects of that connection. Ann and I actually reviewed the first document that Stan Dino and I'm going to retrieve the woman's name who was the co-author produced, and this was a publication through the Council for Exceptional Children. I think most of the curriculum-based measurement people consider that sort of the founding document for curriculum-based measurement, and Ann and I actually reviewed it. And we debated whether, in fact, we should give it a thumbs up, because it was using, it was focused on frequency measures, but it didn't have any standard graphic goal system in it. And so we were sort of hemming and hawing, but decided that, better to support something that's frequency-based rather than some of the less sensitive measures that were currently available and still are, as far as that goes. Mm-hmm. And another interesting piece of information that if Stan Dino came to a workshop that I did a place called Quadna Mountain Lodge up in northern Minnesota. It was a meeting of all the local directors of special ed in the state of Minnesota, and that seems to be, from what I can tell from his writing, the beginning of his shifting away from more traditional kinds of education measures to frequency-based measurement. Mm-hmm. And the very early curriculum-based measurement articles tended to reference exceptional teaching, the book by Norris Herring and Owen White.
Yes.
As you indicate, those tended to fall out, later in their publication history. But early on, you can find pretty consistently a referencing of the exceptional teaching book and sometimes some other precision teaching materials.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've probably been away from that area for quite some time, but did you keep in contact with any of the teachers and follow them through the years to see if they maintained doing precision teaching?
Well, Ann and I arrived in Bemidji, Minnesota in 1970. We left in 1977, and interestingly enough, some of my interest in leaving was 94-142, which is now called IDEA, was passed in 1975, but it was to be implemented in 1977. And my sense is we already had a very sophisticated technology that met the spirit of the law, which is who are the kids and are they learning? We basically had that technology in place, and so I felt that we were currently addressing the spirit of the law, and I just saw this terrible paper nightmare coming at us, and I just was not willing to basically go backwards into a process documenting procedure when we already had a technology that was focused on outcomes and finding the kids that needed the assistance and documenting where they were learning. And kind of as a follow-up to that, so I left in 77, and I think it was the year that we came in 70 was the beginning of this, what was called the Bemidji Regional Inter-District Cooperative. And so I came back in 1990 as a keynote speaker for one of their conferences, and I actually asked some of the teachers who were still there, since when we were there from 70 to 77, there was some grumbling about the response cost of collecting data, getting it charted, since it was a somewhat new process from what they'd been used to. But so here I am back in 1990, 13 years after IDEA has been in place, and they have a great deal of documentation. And I said, if you could go back to just doing precision teaching and not having IDEA, would you? And basically, most of the teachers said they would prefer to have the system that we had in place before IDEA. And so in essence, they saw it as less of a response cost and more relevant than what had come later with much of the documentation now required from IDEA. So that's kind of a perspective that I think is interesting. And of course, as we get better with using technology to help us collect data and retrieve it and analyze it, and hopefully the response cost for collecting data will get less and less, and we can focus on the decisions we want to make to improve students' programs.
That's interesting. As describing IDEA as a paperwork nightmare, certainly when I talk to teachers and others, even graduates from our program, that's accurate. And I don't know if things have gotten better or worse, but when you think about I'm thinking about your comments about how precision teaching met the spirit of the law, now we have this notion of response to intervention. And I've talked to a number of people who point out that precision teaching is really something that's made for response to intervention. I don't know if you've had any thoughts about that.
Well, sure. I mean, in one sense, it's sort of you might say reinventing the wheel. The precision teaching technology exists, and it would be a system that could be used to answer the question of the effectiveness of intervention, which the RTI system is. That's what it's all about. But I think from my perspective, they're not using as sophisticated a technology to answer the RTI questions as is available through precision teaching. So in some sense, I guess if I was to backtrack a little bit, if we look at both IDEA and now NCLB, I like both the laws because they're accountability laws. And one of the questions I frequently ask in courses I teach or workshops I give, should we be accountable in education? And I consistently get educators to say, yes, we should be. And a follow-up question that I frequently ask is, what should we be accountable for? And generally, maybe with some Socratic, method help, we pretty much arrive at learning. And so as a result, that would tell us that, well, yes, educators want to be accountable. They want to be accountable for learning, which means that we have to be able to measure learning in a precise way and communicate back to ourselves in a way that's easy to determine whether, in fact, learning is occurring. And, we have that technology in precision teaching, and it has a lot of, sophistication in terms of history as well as statistical sophistication. So it's unfortunate that with the sophistication of that technology that more people haven't been able to see how powerful it is and adopt it. But that's the history of science.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the history of science, no new paradigm comes in overnight. There's always resistance from the old paradigm, and there's a period of growth and kind of the old paradigm dying and the new paradigm coming in. So, fortunately, I've maintained my optimism. I may not have the privilege of living long enough to see it to being the standard way of assessing student performance, but I'm convinced it will eventually get there.
Yes, I think what you're saying resonates with me, because right now I'm teaching a class, and at the beginning of a class, I always kick it off with, if we have these effective tools, why aren't more people using them? And I think that's hard for people outside of our profession to, wrap their head around, because if you look at the medical profession, or if you look at, well, let's just stick with that. There are certain accountability standards that there are certain things that just will not happen. So you have people on TV like, this guy, Kevin Trudeau, who's hawking all of these, lose weight with, the weight cure they don't want you to know about, or, the natural cures they don't want you to know about. And he was basically sued for a lot of the things that he said. And because in the field of medicine, and there are checks and balances, and I don't know that, I'm like you. I hope that we get to that point where we have that level of accountability, but I don't know that we ever will. And
well, yeah, one kind of example in one paper I've done, I have had a chart, and it's a 400-year history of the development of the thermometer and measuring of human body temperature. It started with Galileo in 1580 or something like that, and as recently as 1992, there is a recalibration of what normal body temperature, the mean of normal body temperature is 98.2. Most people think it's 98.6. So it went through Celsius and Fahrenheit systems, but that's like a 400-year history of creating a precise measurement unit and tool. And I think it's helpful to understand that things just don't change rapidly oftentimes. And it takes, different sciences, things may change more rapidly or less rapidly. But I remember reading somewhere, I don't remember where it was, that when paradigm shifts, first things that happen is the new paradigm gets ignored. Secondly, it gets attacked, and finally it gets accepted.
Yeah.
And the period of time that takes will vary with whatever the contingencies in the environment are and the professional area. Certainly we have a lot of interesting contingencies in the field of education, and it's a public sector system, and so there's a lot of different variables than if you're in the private sector or in a research lab or something like that in terms of moving things forward. So we have some potential disadvantages in terms of quick change in our field.
You probably have this perspective because not only have you worked directly with teachers who were, let's call them in service, but you've also had the chance to work with pre-service teachers. And what would your perspective be on, in terms of, I think one of the biggest challenges, this isn't the only challenge, of having people learn precision teaching is the chart, because that's the engine that drives precision teaching from my perspective. I think you might agree with that. But what is it better to work with in-service teachers, pre-service teachers, or perhaps that's relative?
Well, I mean, as I described my job in Minnesota, it was basically both. And I think in an applied field like education, that we probably should actually require professors to spend a portion of, if not each week, at least each month, out in the field, working with teachers in the field. And there's some contingent problems with that, because particularly in a situation like you're at Penn State, if you're at a major research university, the contingencies are set for research and writing.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not necessarily, they're really not, at least at the University of Oregon, where I worked for 20 years, teaching and service were way, way down the scale in terms of consequences. The focal point was research and writing, and in some sense the focus on asking education professors to spend a certain amount of time in the field is kind of a service-oriented focus. But I think that's an important kind of feedback loop that people who are preparing teachers should have. One thought I had that I didn't really ever get much support for, but it's always hard to probably get a great researcher, a great teacher, and a great service person in the same body. and so it might be something that universities would want to think about, is creating a team system where a researcher, a teacher, and an outreach person basically were a team and collaborated. Of course, you'd have to create some equivalent consequence systems for them so that the researcher didn't get a lot more, consequence in terms of salary or notoriety than the other two. But I think sometimes maybe we need to think about some alternative models to ensure that we, in fact, do create some great teachers who impact students in an optimal way.
Yes, that's interesting. I certainly agree with you that, from my perspective, I've been at two universities, one that had the mission of teaching and the other that had the opposite end, which was research. And what you're saying is certainly true. Being in both settings, you can see people who are research superstars and people that are teaching superstars, and people that have a knack, too, for excellent service. But it is difficult finding partially time and investment to do all of those.
Right.
Let me switch gears and ask you a question about precision teaching and about something that you've written about. When I was speaking with Steve Graff, I mentioned this idea to him about you, and it's your perspective about the science of education. And if I understood your idea, you talk a lot about the science of education and how that's very important, and actually precision teaching would be one way or one method of conducting science, scientific science in education, if that makes sense. Am I getting the gist of that message?
Yeah, I think that, more broadly than precision teaching, if you think in terms of the behavior analysis world, which precision teaching would be considered a portion of, this whole notion of Skinner's original work, saying that his interest was applying natural science observation and measurement to human behavior and learning. So I think that's the foundational concept that we're really trying to ask a similar question that physics or chemistry or biology would ask in terms of looking at, specifically in terms of our conversation, education, but more broadly in terms would be areas, any area of human behavior. And in fact, this is a little bit of a stretch potentially, but I've tended to view measurement standardization in terms of terminology, in terms of measurement units, recording procedures, display systems, is pretty much a synonym for science. That's not quite a clean match, but I think it's a pretty good place to begin.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you think about science, it's really an attempt to discover information, laws, to be able to be consistent about being able to predict things. And most, I'd say all professions, they're interested in doing that. And so if education is interested in understanding better the effects of their interventions, and one way they can accomplish that is to get more scientific, and that pretty much means getting more standardized in your terminology, measurement units, procedures, measurement procedures, and display systems. And once you've done that, then you have the potential to be more effective in your analysis and decision making. So, an interesting thing that's probably a problem in our profession is that people who really wanted to be scientists probably originally went into the harder sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, and a lot of people who came into education might not have been particularly scientific oriented. And so we may have had a selection problem where maybe the people who came into education had more of a leaning toward like arts and humanities and less toward sciences. And now as we try to get more accountable, which by the way, the word count is in accountable, it very much is about, when you think about accountability, it really is very much about measurement and numbers. That's why accountants do play with numbers.
Mm-hmm.
That is really what that word is about. So when an educator says, yes, I want to be accountable, they may not know it, but what they're really agreeing to is getting more scientific, more numeric, more measurement oriented. And I think one of the problems that educators have, and Ogden was pretty eloquent about this, says love and science are not antagonistic. You can hug kids and love them and still be scientific. And in some ways, I think if you are more scientific and the information you get is more reliable and more valid, then in fact you will make better decisions in terms of improving student programs, and that's a very loving type of thing to do, to ensure that a child gets the best education and achieves their optimal level of performance. It's a very loving thing to do, but you're not going to do that as effectively if your feedback to yourself is not as precise. So I think it's an important understanding that science is not an attempt to dehumanize our students or people. It is merely an attempt to inform ourselves better so we make better decisions, and as a result, people have better lives. And so that's a really important point, I think, that we get arguing about or people miss.
I think that's an excellent perspective, because oftentimes many people have stereotypes of science. Many people don't understand science. In fact, if you look at a lot of the polls of what people believe in, and then you look at scientific literacy, you can see a pretty amazing correlation there in some of the pseudoscientific beliefs people have. But I think talking about the human part is just a really great perspective. In fact, when I was a graduate student, my graduate advisor, Dr. John Cooper, he always used to talk about the big heart. Have you heard of that concept before? I mean, it sounds like exactly what Ogden's saying. But
well, I mean, Ogden would frequently, on the end of a presentation, that workshop he was doing, he'd put a copy of the standard chart up, and they didn't put a big red heart up on top of it. And so there's the love and science combination. And so that sounds like somewhat what John is talking about as well. And as I continue to mature, one of the things that I frequently find is that many dichotomies are really both. And actually, my advisor Eric Houghton was famous for saying, "I choose both." But so it's not that love and science are antagonistic. They can be complementary, and it's not that objective and subjective information is antagonistic. They can be complementary. Something I shared with you recently. I've just finished a chapter called Science and Spirituality, and a lot of people would think that those two concepts are antagonistic, but I think they're complementary as well. So I increasingly see dichotomies in the world that probably are both, and I have a feeling that maybe Western culture is much more focused on dichotomies, and maybe it started with Descartes and with the mind-body separation, as opposed to maybe some of the Eastern cultures that have more of the yin and yang sort of complementary notion. So in the Western cultures, we seem to want to dichotomize, and it may be because of our competitive spirit, and we want to have an argument or a discussion and try to see who can win. I haven't totally figured out what in the Western kind of mind kind of wants to focus on antagonism or dichotomies, but I seem to see that, and I'm increasingly saying, well, I think it's both.
That we should have some kind of catchphrase with "do both" or "consider both,"
right.
Because that is excellent point.
I mean, one of the things that I've frequently done, and I find teachers resonate with this. I think you've done it as well. But I'll go into a teacher's classroom and say, I'd like you to rank your students from the best reader to the poorest reader, or the most creative student to the least creative student, and then go in and collect some direct observational information. And it frequently matches very well at the high and low end. Sometimes it's a little mixed up in the middle. But what that tends to do for teachers is it gives them trust in that kind of information, because they see that it matches their perception. And that's in essence what direct observational measures are, is a measure of what we see and hear. Frequently we'll get the critique about, well, sure, you can measure reading, writing, and arithmetic that way, but how about creativity? And I have kind of a cute story in one of the classes I was teaching. The fellow, I'm not remembering his name at the moment, but he was a fourth grade teacher, and so this discussion was occurring, saying, well, yeah, it's easy to measure some of these basic skills things, but how about creativity? And I'm thinking his name was like Keith, but so that's why I said, Keith, do you have kids in your classroom that are more creative and less creative? And he said, well, of course. And then I knew that I was in a position to query him further and find out what he was observing that would enable him to make that comment. And it turned out to be things like, well, the more creative kids use, more elaborate vocabulary. They come up with more novel ideas. And so he ticked off 3 or 4 different things about his perception of how you make that difference. Now, since creativity is a bit of a squishy concept, different people may have different criteria. But the fact is, if you say you observe a difference in creativity, then you can measure that difference. And once you do, then you start having a sensitive index of whether someone's getting more creative, meaning they're coming up with more novel concepts, or they're using more elaborate vocabulary. So I think the power of direct observational measures is a nice complement to our subjectivity. And I think a third one is probably some direct, permanent record types of things, written records or video records. I've written some about, I think those are the three complementary aspects of student evaluation. That you have an objective record, in our case, a standard graphic chart. You have perceptions and comments from peers, parents, teachers, and then you have a permanent record. And when those three things agree, I am assuming that we have a pretty firm evidence of true learning. But that's all to say that objective and subjective are not antagonistic. They should be complementary.
Do you see a difference between measuring behavior and monitoring behavior? The reason why I'm asking you this is you use measurement, I think, is a way I would similarly use this, but some people have written that there's a difference between the two. And measurement sometimes takes on a different connotation.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure I'm totally clear, but I would say, if we're using the precision teaching technology, we talk about measuring both performance, which is our more static measure, and learning, which is the dynamic measure, and our performance measure is frequency or rate of response, and our learning measure is the change in that frequency over time, usually in terms of classroom and in terms of the standard daily charges over a week's time. So, our monitoring measure, is the learning picture that you see on the standard chart, or the technical term we use, acceleration. So we have a technology that enables us to track learning, and if that's what you're meaning by monitoring, and other people are meaning by monitoring, our measurement technology enables us to monitor learning. And so I don't know that I'm not sure I make some sort of distinction between those two terms.
Well, let me also ask you, this is a question I always like asking people who have been around precision teaching for quite some time, and that is, if I were to ask you, how do you define precision teaching? How would you define precision teaching?
Well, it's a important and good question, and I think over the years it's become a bit of a complicated question, and so I think my answer requires a little bit of historical perspective. Initially, Ogden's notion was to establish a broad practice and what he entitled precise behavioral management, and this involved the introduction of frequency-based measurement, standard charting, pre-operant conditioning into various applied fields. And so his original notion is thus we would end up with precision social work and precision nursing, precision rehabilitation, and precision teaching. But I think what happened was, because the initial application was in the special ed area, and then more later on in general education, precision teaching kind of became the generic term for the technology, and it wasn't just restricted to education, but it kind of grew from there. Precision teaching became sort of the synonym for this kind of broader notion that Ogden has of applying the natural science to human behavior. So, it's in some ways I've sort of been torn between wanting to kind of maintain that original notion and say, well, precision teaching is about education, but precision nursing is about nursing. Social work is about social work. And so I've tended to want to kind of hold on to the term precision teaching to be focused on education. So with that preamble, the way I would define it is it's an educational decision-making process that uses frequency or count over time as a standard performance measure displayed on a standard rate of change chart. And that actually is an adaptation of a definition that Ogden used in a 1992 article. And so that's kind of the tight definition. I think one of the things that also has happened, originally I would emphasize very sternly that precision teaching was not a methodology; it was a measurement technology. And to say that precision teaching worked would be like saying a thermometer worked.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't make any sense. I mean, it's just like it doesn't work or not work. It's just a system for measuring whether what you're doing is working or not. But over the years, we've learned a lot about effective interventions. The whole notion of composite relationships, slicing back, stepping back, short duration practice, what we call sprints, using fluency aims. So in the process of measuring and observing and learning, in essence, what has now evolved is methodological technology that people tend to associate with precision teaching. So at this point in time, I sort of see it somewhat as both. We still have the original measurement technology that is focused on trying to create the most sophisticated measurement of human behavior that we can. But in that process, we've learned a lot, and so now most people who are involved in what's called precision teaching also use a lot of the methodological things that have been learned. So it's tended to shift into a methodology as well. So at this point, I sort of see it as both.
So precision teaching early on could have actually been, if it was more like precision learning or measurement or whatever, it could have been precision nursing, precision so on, but it happened to stick in the area of teaching. And as time moved on, now, as what you're saying is it's really, people are actually associating with a lot of the things that were discovered in the teaching field. Is that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that because when Ogden moved to the University of Kansas, he was in a research setting in special education. So he actually moved out of the field of psychology, which is where his degrees were, into special education, and then subsequently later in his career he was in education leadership training administrators. So much of the application of the technology was in education, and as a result, I think precision teaching became sort of a synonym for basically, the measurement of human behavior. But obviously, there's lots of other fields that, including things like economics, sociology, psychology, animal behavior, and there's plenty of other fields that are interested in measuring human or animal behavior besides education. So the technology certainly is applicable across all those other fields. But most people, when they hear teaching, they have a tendency to think of education. And so, in essence, precision teaching has become sort of the synonym for measuring human behavior in this way. But there's certainly been, there's been a number of applications in other fields, nursing and rehabilitation, and psychology. So it isn't like there aren't other applications occurring even now, but it's still certainly more broadly implemented in the education areas, both public and private sectors.
Let me put you on the spot here. In terms of the future development of precision teaching, what would you consider as either important new areas to research or things as a field, and when I say field, I mean people who are practicing, people who are teaching, things that should occur more often? Might have asked you two questions in there.
Yeah, well, I certainly think, there's, I'll kind of use my background in reading a little bit. Not really totally facetiously, I've said for a number of years, I would like to get to the point that we can encounter a person with a reading problem and inoculate them, and they will be cured. So, of course, using the medical analogy of an inoculation to prevent getting polio or some other dreaded disease. And so, now that would translate to me was something like, well, we can take a youngster and within a relatively short time, a week or two, pretty much break through the difficulty and be pretty assured that they're going to become a competent reader. I'm not sure that we're at that stage, and it probably has a lot to do with being a relatively new science. And one of the things that you'll consistently see across sciences is you start to break through in learning powerful interventions once you get your measurement technology, in good shape, because it enables you to start getting a feedback loop that's much more reliable and valid, and therefore your decisions start to be more effective. So I'm anticipating in the future that we will start to get better and better and better about being able to assess where a student is, select an appropriate intervention, and make very dramatic changes very quickly. So days and weeks rather than months and years. And I just think it's a matter of continuing to sort of synthesize the information that we're learning from looking at standard learning charts. Things like the sprint kinds of notion of short duration practice. I'm still not sure maybe we appreciate the massive amount of practice it takes to really get good at things. I had a student in one of my courses, undergraduate courses, that was the three-point shooting champion on the women's basketball team at the University of Oregon in the Pac-10. And we were having this discussion about how much practice it takes to get really good at stuff. Her name was Jamie Craighead.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just started having a conversation with her in class. And I said, so Jamie, how many three-point shots do you shoot a day? She said 100. And said, and how many days a year did you do that? I said, about 360. and she was a junior at the time. And I said, and how many years have you been doing that? She said, well, since I've been a 7th or 8th grader. And I computed it out, and it was something like 250,000 three-point shots. So and of course this is true excellence. But I think one of the things we want to help people achieve is excellence. Most of the people that I know that are really skilled at something, and particularly if they can make a living doing it, they love what they're doing. So I think we have a lot of work to do to understand how much practice it takes to get really good at things. And one of the things I would hope that we will do in education is early on help children find their strengths and interests and passions, and help them get really good at that in hopes that maybe that would be the way they can make a living. I think one of the saddest things I see in the world is people who spend 40 hours a week for 40 years doing something they really aren't very excited about, so they can maybe go do something that they really do like to do. And that's a lot of time to spend in your life not enjoying life. So I think our technology can help us, learn how to, really teach people well and teach them to be really excellent at something. delighted to spend their life doing something they do well and making a contribution to others. I certainly could think about some other things, but I don't know how we're doing on our time here.
Well, we're heading to the end of our podcast or our interview, and what I'd like to do is ask you if there's anything else that I should have asked you or any other things that you'd like to share with the audience.
Yeah, I guess there's maybe one thing I think sort of interest and might be pertinent is I think it's probably helpful to make a distinction between research and science, and since much of any field tends to depend on their research to move their field forward, that my sense, again, this might be a bit simplistic, but if you look at the research field, it seems like maybe you could kind of divide it up into two big chunks. The research methodology portion, like whether you're going to choose an experimental control design or a single subject design, that kind of methodological kind of question. And then the measurement question, what kind of measures are you going to use to determine your, in essence, the dependent variable kind of process. And I have my sense in our field, and I think actually the meta-analysis basically depicts this. I really think meta-analysis is an indictment of our field, because what it really is telling us is we can't agree on our measures, and therefore we have to create a meta-system in order to compare studies, because the measures are so discrepant across the studies. And so my sense is that we really need to get the measurement technology cleaned up. That's kind of the step before the research methodology. So you can have a really elegant research design and research methodology, but if your measures are really insensitive, like achievement test scores or intelligence test scores, you're probably not going to learn much from your study, even if the methodology was quite elegant. And so in that sense, I think it's pretty critical that we get our measurement technology standardized and agreed upon across the profession. And then I think we're in a position to start really making some major discoveries. But until then, I don't think we will. We will tend to kind of do the two major cycles I've seen in education over the years, on and off. You see it, and you never see it again, and circular. It's here, it's gone, now it's back again. And that's not a very good way to accumulate knowledge. And so if we're hoping to become a true profession and really accumulate knowledge, this whole area of measurement is a really important kind of first step along the way to doing that. So I guess that would be my closing comment.
Well, that is an excellent closing comment, because what you said, actually, when you were talking about that basketball player, here a few years ago at Penn State, we had a woman, her name is Kelly Mazzanti, and Kelly now plays for the WBA, and when she was here, she broke every Big Ten record and was just a fantastic player. But I spoke to her dad once, and she was going through a slump, and I asked her dad, well, what is she going to do to break out of that slump? And she said, she went down to the gym, and she'll shoot about 500 free throws. And I thought, wow. And, that's not her typical thing, but as we were talking, he mentioned similar things, that she would just basically shoot hundreds of baskets a day. And if we had that kind of knowledge and education about other things, I think it would just move our field so far out of the social sciences and maybe into as the natural sciences.
Yeah, I frequently point out to educators that if you want to look to professions who understand the importance of practice to achieving excellence or mastery or fluency, other words we use, look to athletics and performing arts, and particularly music. They have understood for a very long time how much practice it takes to really get good at something. And sometimes I get people saying, well, not everyone can get good at things. One, I don't believe it. There's a fella now. I have his book, but I think I'm going to block on his name. I think he's a Swedish fellow, but teaches in Florida at one of the universities. Eric.
Anders Eriksson.
Right.
It's Anders Eriksson, I think.
Okay.
Is that his name?
Thank you. I believe.
Yeah.
And he's pretty much disproved this notion that there's innate talent, and those are the ones who become virtuosos through a lot of his work. He pretty much said, given that you don't have some major cognitive disability, that the major difference between those who achieve virtuoso status is the amount of practice.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we have evidence now that this notion of, some people are born to be gifted athletes and some are born to be gifted musicians. There's certainly the potential that there are some, physiological advantages. But it looks like, if the playing field is somewhat equivalent in terms of your physical, kind of makeup, dexterity, height, musculature, etc., that the variable that sorts is how much practice you are willing to put in to get really good. And so that's a real encouragement, I think, to all of us, that the potential to achieve excellence, to be able to perform, with relative ease in the world, and hopefully maybe even use some of those skills for a livelihood, I think is pretty much accessible to the majority of people, and that should be encouraging to us as a profession, and I think should be a charge to us to try to get more and more people to be really excellent at what they do, and hopefully be happy in the work they're doing and in the skills that they're able to perform in their life. And as I said earlier, I think we still haven't quite achieved the level of skill about how we can do that, and yet I think we can look to both athletics and music, and particularly of a couple of professions or professional areas that have learned, that John Wooden, well-known basketball coach for UCLA, who won 14 or 15 NCAA championships, talked about muscle memory. And the notion was you just have to do it over and over until your muscles remember. And I think that's true in academic skills. It's true in social skills. There's a certain social fluency that goes on to interacting with others. And those who don't have it, we can call retarded or antisocial or eccentric. So I think it's the concept of practice and achieving excellence really applies to any area of human behavior that we might be interested in helping a person become skilled in.
I certainly would like to not just thank you for your time today, but your message is very liberating and forward-thinking, and I think that's one of the things that has attracted me all the time to precision teaching, that we have this technology and we can apply it for good, and you really have just a wonderful perspective on that. So let me thank you not only for sharing that message, but for taking time out of your day to speak with me and our audience.
Well, it was my pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you at our next Precision Teaching Conference, and hope that any of the folks who tune into this podcast will, if they're not already involved, will come and join us at some of our precision teaching events, and consider being part of the group.
And I ditto. Okay, Clay. Well, thank you very much for your time.
You bet. Take care.
Well, that brings us to the end of another podcast. And as usual, if you have any suggestions for future guests, if you have any new segments you might like to listen to, please send me your feedback. I would love to hear from you. Also, I would let you know that in each podcast there is now a section for you to write comments and respond to. And I know that the people who do these podcasts, the people I interview, would really appreciate to have that feedback. So please make use of that. And as usual, I will look forward to speaking with you again. Goodbye.